Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's November 16th. And we will be discussing with Rabbi Serotta, Bye-Bye Braverman.
Great. Well, again, welcome. And I hope you all had a chance to see it. And I'm talking about how does it connect up to the apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz? Well, I'm going to say maybe three things about that up front. One is that when we talked about Duddy Kravitz last week, we talked about unlikable characters, right? You know, that not everybody in these movies about Jews are necessarily the most likable characters. And I think we might find that about Bye-Bye Braverman as well. And similar in a way to the performance of Richard Dreyfuss in that movie. You know, the only reason we like anything about these characters, I think, is because of the people who are playing them. I think George Segal, in particular, manages to make a character that is both repellent and somehow likable. So I think that's the first thing I'd say in terms of a connection. The most obvious sort of connection is just that one of the actors who was in Duddy Kravitz appears here. We mentioned him last week, of course. And that's the one who plays Felix Adenstein in this movie. And where am I about the cast here? Joseph Wiseman, right? Who we talked about him last week. He plays the uncle who owns the clothing factory in The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz about 5 years or so after this movie was made. This movie is from 1968. And Joseph Wiseman, if you remember, we talked about last week that he's in the first James Bond movie, Dr. No, where he plays that character, Dr. No, the first Bond villain. And I don't know if you caught it, but I think there's a kind of a visual joke in this movie when they get to the funeral where Alan King is the rabbi. He talks about everybody these days trying to live like James Bond. And it cuts to Joseph Wiseman sitting in the audience. So, you know, just what was this, 6 years after Dr. No was made. So it's just a little visual joke for us that if you are the popular culture mavens that these characters purport to be, you would, of course, know that Joseph Wiseman was Dr. No. And so kind of a cute thing there. So, but the third connection I'd make is really, it's a very old trope in Jewish literature, and in talking about Jews, we talk about the wandering Jew. And this movie is quite literally about wandering Jews, you know, right? In the most literal sense, right? They're wandering all over Brooklyn, trying to find their way to the right funeral, you know? And to the best, do they ever get there?
I don't think so.
Not really, no. So you know, and I would compare this to Duddy Kravitz, right? The same sort of search for what makes a person, what makes a person whole in life, right? And in Duddy Kravitz, we see a character who is always going after the wrong thing, in a sense, right? He's taken so literally this idea of a man without land is nothing, that he'll do anything to get there, right? And believes that the end justifies the means, right? So these characters are a little bit different than that, but they're also sort of lost. You know, they are Jews. They are each sort of involved in Judaism in their own way, but they have, in a sense, we don't see any of them really doing anything in terms of Jewish meaning and content, right, that would enrich their lives. So they're left sort of wandering, looking for meaning. And I'd say in a larger sense, maybe if this movie plays at all with people who are not Jewish, which I'm not sure it does, it's a very insulated, very Jewish picture of the world. But if it plays at all, it's about the meaning of life itself, right? What, you know, there's a debate somewhere in there about, is it, in a sense, is it, they debate everything, these guys, right? even cartoon characters, comic strip characters. But is it better to die, in the middle? And they say this about Braverman, he died in the middle, and it's good. At least he didn't die at the beginning. And then George Segal has one of the sort of dreams within the movie that he has, of the two guys on the bus, and they're saying, "Hey, did you see that he died?" And and say, yeah, he worked as a fundraiser, but people were reading some of his writing, and it comes back, and George Segal says, "No, it's better to die at the beginning when you're sure of yourself, when you know what you're going to do, and you're going to be talented and all that stuff. Better to die then than in the middle when you don't really know who you are or where you're going, right?" Of course, perhaps the best is to die at the end, but in truth, none of us does that, right? Because there's always something else on the horizon, right? Something else we're intending to do. So, so those are the connections I would make to Duddy Kravitz. I mean, he too is a wandering Jew. In fact, that last scene that we talked about last week, where he comes out of the deli and goes first in one direction and then the other, is kind of a little visual sense of what we're talking about, that he doesn't know where he is or where he's going. He is a wandering Jew, right? And so these movies also then have something in common, I think, which is sort of maybe it's a little bit of a timepiece for us now, but the sense of Jews in America, Jews in Canada, and the Duddy Kravitz story, trying to figure out where they are in the world. What role does their Judaism play in their Americanized lives? What does it mean for them, right? They're hanging on to it, but does it have real meaning? They're alienated, but they're not alienated by the fact that they're Jewish. Not exactly, So, but none of the things that they do, their writing, their politics, their sex, their marriage, right? None of those things seems to give them real contentment or serenity. Right? They're continuing to wander. So maybe that's a little too heavy for what's essentially a comedy. Again, like some of the other movies we've watched, it's kind of a dark comedy, but there's definitely comedy to it. It's based on a novel, by a guy named Wallace Markfield, which not a particularly Jewish sounding name, but a Jewish author in the 1960s. The book was called To an Early Grave. It was his first book. It was published in 1964. He wrote a few books and passed away relatively young. In addition to writing some novels, he, like characters in this movie, he wrote criticism and essays and things like that. He was born in Brooklyn in 1926, died in 2002. I found his obituary in the New York Times, actually, from 2002. It says that this book that was turned into the movie Bye Bye Braverman said, critics compared it to Joyce's Ulysses, which, by the way, I've got to say, that sounds like something a character in this movie would say, more than it sounds like something that's really true. To the best of my knowledge, I couldn't find reviews of the book really, online. I said sort of a short week in preparation for this one because we didn't know we were going to be showing it. But it's hard to imagine anybody comparing this to Ulysses. Critics praised its juxtaposition of tragedy and comedy. I think we see that in this film. And actually, a funny little side note that in Philip Roth's book, Portnoy's Complaint, he actually sort of steals a joke and attributes it. The character Portnoy in Portnoy's Complaint talks about this story by this author, Mark Markfield, who says until he was 14, he believed that aggravation was a Jewish word. So, which is a good line. And so when Philip Roth saw it in Markham's story from the 50s, he included it in his book, Portnoy's Complaint. He credited it. He didn't steal it. He said it's by this author, Markham, but he couldn't resist it, right? So I think that tells us a little bit about the kind of work that that Wallace Markfield did. So as I said, 5 or 6 novels, I think, and a lot of articles and criticism, a lot of things that sound a lot like the characters in this book, in this movie, rather. The movie's directed by Sidney Lumet, who by this point should be a pretty familiar figure to those who have been with us from the early days of these classes. This is, I think, the 4th movie by Sidney Lumet that we've watched. And so, so if there's a Jewish Directors Hall of Fame, right, he's got to be right up there at the top. Certainly, the movies he made, not just the movies with, though a lot of his movies have Jews in them, almost all of his movies take place in New York. He rarely left the city for movies, but if you remember, we saw The Pawnbroker, of course. We saw the movie Daniel, based on the E.L. Doctorow book. We watched Running on Empty. So about the sort of 60s countercultural revolutionaries hiding out, in the 80s, right? So those are some of the earlier texts that we looked at out at Sidney Lumet. But we should also remember he started out, he made 12 Angry Men was his movie directing debut. And actually, Jack Warden, who was in this movie, was in 12 Angry Men. That was one of his first films. But he also made Serpico, Dog Day Afternoon, Network, and The Verdict with Paul Newman. So this is a highly successful director. We've talked about him in the past. He got his start on live television in the 1950s. He was famous for working quickly. He's not a guy who did dozens of takes of the same scene. He liked to rehearse as if the movie was a play beforehand and then shoot. Right? In particular about this movie, he says that he wrote a book, I think it's called On Directing, actually, if memory serves. But he says about this movie that it's the story of 4 post-Depression Jewish intellectuals. They're everyone I grew up with. Me, in fact. I knew all these neighborhoods like the back of my hand. It must have taken about 5 minutes to scout the locations for the whole works. So, he recognized these characters in the book. He felt as if he knew them as if he was one of them. So I think that that's a pretty interesting note that he has there. And so he made all of these incredible films in his lifetime. Frankly, if there was a Hall of Fame directors, not just Jewish directors, he's in it. There's classics that he made. This may not be one of his classics, and I think it may be of limited appeal outside of the Jewish community, and maybe within the Jewish community of limited appeal, but worth a look for sure. It falls into a category in the late 1960s. There are a number of movies about these sort of alienated Jews, I'd say. They're not quite sure where to turn. There's one with Peter Sellers called I Love You, Alice B. Toklas. I think it came out maybe the same year or maybe a year later. A year later, Goodbye Columbus comes to the movie screen. It was published 10 years before that in 1959, but it shows up in movie theaters in 1969. And all of them is sort of Jews as outsiders, not quite sure who they are and where they fit. And perhaps that's a picture of the culture of the time, right? There was a lot being written at that time about self-hating Jews. it's a term I find pretty repellent, actually. So I heard Peter Beinart say once, I've met a lot of Jews who hate other Jews, but I've never met one who hates himself, right? So I think there's some truth to that. So I'm not really sure if that self-hating label is a good one, but being unsure where we fit in society, I mean, I think that might be a Jewish characteristic even now. So for anyone who had to fill out a survey and they ask you whether you're white or not, and you have that little question in your mind about, I don't know if that's, is that really the way I identify, right? So it's we always have sort of those questions, I think. The screenplay was written by a guy named Herb Sargent, whose last name was actually Supowitz, but changed to Sargent in show business. He's probably best known for being the first producer of Saturday Night Live. So he did that for 20 years and appeared in the credits of every episode of Saturday Night Live. Before that, he worked with The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and going all the way back to Steve Allen. So he won several Emmys for his work on late night. He, among other things, he labeled the first cast of Saturday Night Live the not ready for primetime players. That was one of his, he coined that, and it stuck. And he also helped develop the news update segment of Saturday Night Live. So something that's gone on now since, for what, 50 years, it's kind of remarkable when you think about it. So his brother was actually an Oscar-winning writer of screenplays as well. So that's sort of the creative team behind the scenes. Because we've seen George Segal before. We saw him in No Way to Treat a Lady. Just died this year, actually. So a Jewish actor, Jack Warden, we mentioned last week, who also appears in The Apprenticeship of Duddy Kravitz, right? So he plays friends with the character played by Joseph Weisman this week. Last week, he was the brother of Joseph Weisman, right? And he lived from 1920 to 2006. As I've said, depending on what biography you read of his, there is a Jewish grandparent. But he certainly was not raised Jewish and didn't pretend to be. But he grew up in New York City and certainly knew from Judaism, right? Joseph Weisman, of course, was Jewish. We've talked about him already today. Perhaps you recognized Sorrel Book, the fourth of the quartet of these guys. Not perhaps as well known certainly as some of the others, but if you're a TV watcher, well, first of all, if you look him up, you'll find out he has hundreds of credits to his name. But you can see in the top row of what Vanessa, well, and actually all over, you see him with the big cowboy hat on. If you remember the TV series, The Dukes of Hazzard, he plays Boss Hogg in The Dukes of Hazzard. And by the way, had to wear a fat suit to do it. He was not as heavy as he appears in that picture, right? But he was in many other TV shows and other things like that. If you go back farther than Dukes of Hazzard, you may remember a TV show called Room 222. And he plays the Jewish teacher in Room 222, Mr. Bomberg. He passed away in 1994, but prior to that, I mean, there's hundreds of credits in movies and television, all sorts of things. Definitely Jewish actor. And then some of the other people in the movie that you may have recognized, Jessica Walter, of course, who again, hundreds and hundreds of credits to her name. Probably never quite as big a star as she really deserved to be. She's probably best remembered these days for playing the mother in Arrested Development TV series. She actually, until her death this year, was doing voiceovers for a cartoon series called Archer, which actually had a loving farewell to her in their final episode this season. There's a picture of her and her cartoon image in that show.
When I was reading, she died just one day apart from George Segal.
Is that right?
Mhm.
I remember that so clearly. She is of Russian Jewish descent as well. So most of the characters in here playing Jews are Jews. Whether non-Jews can play Jews, that's a question, yes, but Jack Warden is one, and I think he does a fine job. And one who is not Jewish, but played Jewish in this movie is Godfrey Cambridge, who you may remember, the African-American, best known probably as a stand-up comedian, but he did play some parts in movies and on television. And I actually remember seeing him in a Broadway show when I was a kid, by Neil Simon, not one of Neil Simon's great works, I guess, not really remembered by many, but it's called God's Favorite. God's Favorite was Neil Simon's comic retelling of the Book of Job, actually. So, and Godfrey Cambridge was the star. So I remember seeing him in that when I was a kid myself. He's did a lot of good work, died very young, had a heart attack. I was only like 40 years old, I think. So he's younger than he looks in this. I think that I don't know if anyone saw the movie he stars in, Watermelon Man, where he plays a white racist who wakes up one day to find himself black. Which was primarily marketed in the African American community, but it fairly well known. A couple of other people in the cast worth mentioning, certainly Alan King, who again best known as a comedian for his appearances on The Tonight Show and on the Ed Sullivan Show, kind of a storyteller comedian, not so much quick one-liners as stories that built and are funny. He appears in several movies directed by Sidney Lumet. He even stars in one called Just Tell Me What You Want, which I think has been remade in recent years, if memory serves. And we also saw him also playing a rabbi in a movie that we watched a while back, Enemies, a Love Story, where he hires a Holocaust survivor to the main character in our story, Enemies, a Love Story, to write his speeches for him. So here he's a rabbi who doesn't seem to need a ghostwriter, but maybe an editor. An interesting characterization. I think we'll talk about that, I'm sure, as we go on.
In the chat, Marcia said Jessica Walter, also known for Play Misty for Me.
Yes.
The villain in Play Misty for Me. And that
one of the first movies directed by Clint Eastwood, actually.
Right. And Neil said Godfrey Cambridge spoke Yiddish.
Yes. Well, again, I think, he wasn't Jewish, but he was steeped in the culture enough, But I knew people in New York who spoke Yiddish just because they lived in New York, right? I mean, they heard it enough, from shopkeepers and whatever, the delivery guys and whatever, they picked up the lingo, So Godfrey Cambridge is a good example of that, I think. A couple of the other, the women, of course, unfortunately have very minor roles. It's not really a woman's picture by any means, but the women in it, Jessica Walter has her big scene. They each kind of have their own scene. Phyllis Newman, who plays Myra Mandelbaum, that's the one, she's the lover of Jack Warden. She's probably best known as a game show panelist, to be honest. She was a regular on To Tell the Truth and What's My Line, right, back in the 1960s. But she was also married to Adolph Green, the songwriter of Comden and Green. And she, there's a lot of interesting things about her. I mean, there's probably a life story to be told about her. She won the Tony in 1962 for her role in a musical called Subways Are for Sleeping. I think it might have been a Comden and Green composition. I'm not entirely sure, but the one of the other nominees that year was Barbra Streisand. So she beat out Barbra Streisand for a Tony in 1962. Apparently her husband Adolph Green told her later that he voted for Streisand, but nevertheless, she won here. She's the first woman to be the substitute host on the Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. So long before Joan Rivers guest hosted, Phyllis Newman was a guest host. So I think that's interesting. There's a little bit of a thing. So the name of her character in this movie is Myra Mandelbaum, I think from the Bronx. And nevertheless, Jack Warden's mother seems to think of her as being a shiksa, right? I think she uses that word about her. So their whole argument is about visiting his mother, and so it's kind of strange. So she also years later was nominated for a Tony for her role in the Neil Simon play Broadway Bound. So she had a long career. I mean, it's interesting. She never became a big star. But and again, if you look her up, you'll see on every TV series you ever watched, probably, at some time or another playing a small part. Zora Lampart is in this movie. She actually was nominated for 2 Tonys in 1961 and in 1963, so 5 years before this. I don't know if you remember about Sidney Lumet, but he got his start as an actor in Yiddish plays in New York. So he was very much a creature of the theater. So he knew all these folks, and of course he did all his work in and around New York. So he would see these actors on stage and cast them in movie roles. So Zora Lampart is one of those as well. So she plays, I believe she's the wife, right? The wife of George Siegel's character. Also of Russian Jewish descent, right? So those are the main folks who I just point out. The one who plays, and again, I think there she is as a spokesman for Goya Beans, which I don't remember those commercials, but she did that for her bio says for about 10 years, right? She never really got the breaks she deserved, I don't think. I mean, I look at her and think, that this could be a leading lady, but for whatever reason, didn't make it in Hollywood the way, even after a couple of Tony nominations and some other things. I think she what's the name? She's in a thriller that's the name's eluding me at the moment, but if I think of it, I'll let you know. But rarely had a starring part in anything. Anthony Holland plays Adenstein's son. He has that one scene in the deli near the beginning. He's in a lot of movies. You'll see him in small parts in All That Jazz, The Out of Towners, Clute, Midnight Cowboy, things like that. Someone mentioned Splendor in the Grass. She's got one real scene in Splendor in the Grass, but she steals it from Natalie Wood and Warren Beatty. So it's a pretty good scene. What year is that? 1961, maybe. So Anthony Holland's interesting actor. I mean, he lived from 1928 to 1988. He was born in Brooklyn. He was a Jewish guy. He died from suicide, but he was diagnosed with AIDS. And that was back in the 80s. And there was, he saw what was coming, let's say, I guess, and decided to leave early. The last person I'll just mention quickly is Graham Jarvis, just because his face may have looked familiar. He's the guy on the bus that George Segal comes up behind him and tells him the answer to a crossword puzzle, right? So he may have looked familiar to you. I mean, he's had a long acting career, a lot of character parts. He's in movies like A New Leaf with Elaine May and What's Up, Doc with Barbara Streisand and Ryan O'Neal, and hundreds of other things. Might be best remembered as playing Mary Hartman's husband, I think, right? In the PBS comedy soap opera, Mary Hartman. So certainly worth thinking about. So a lot of folks doing a lot of good work in small parts in this movie. So the movie itself, right? I mean, we have this, it feels like sort of an odyssey in its way, right? First hearing the news of the death of Braverman, and you may remember the first thing that Monroe thinks of when he hears of death is, how much did I lend him? $135, and so he says 137, I think. Right? So then he starts to think about it more. So going to see his ex-wife, I guess, Inez, because he wasn't living with her, and then gathering up the friends to go find the funeral, which they have only sort of a vague idea of where it is. And so off to Brooklyn to find the proper funeral home, the proper funeral, and get there. So
I keep thinking, obviously this crowd knows what a phone booth is and they couldn't Google it, but many times, more than once, at Legacy Lakeside, people would come in to a bar mitzvah, sit for like half an hour, and then I was always there, and they'd come out and say, is this blah, blah, blah. And I remember once it was for a girl who, had been adopted from Korea. Like, how could you not notice that this isn't your person? And then where is Solel? And then they'd have to get back on, but that happens all the time.
It was funny, and I don't know if it happened in Legacy Solel as well, but I think Lakeside being on Lake Cook Road, we frequently got people who were either looking for Solel or looking for North Shore Congregation Israel.
Or Bidgeby.
Later, once BJB moved up to Deerfield Road, to Lake Cook Road, right? So people would just see a saying, that must be it, and they'd stop, Not so much local people, because they know that there were lots of congregations around, but I always said it was partly those people who had like spatial things, they would think they were looking for Solel because we were so parallel, right? So they just got off on the wrong street. That's it, right? And pull in. And others who had a different kind of thing, they were thinking North Shore, but they would see the word Lakeside, and it would click in their head, and they'd come into the parking lot. But anyway, so yeah, people will sit for an incredibly long time in a service that is not.
Yes, they will. Susan.
Yeah.
You unmuted me, Vanessa?
Yes, I did.
Okay. So one of the things that bothered me a lot about this rabbi was, as much as they said they wanted to go to the funeral, they kept allowing themselves to be distracted.
Yeah.
It was like, how badly did they really want to go?
Right.
Because there was one distraction after another, and they just fed right into them. Yep. So that it was obvious they were never going to get to this funeral.
Yeah. And I think, the Alan King character, the rabbi who speaks, there's a lot of silliness about that, I suppose, and a fair amount of part of the joke is how much he talks, right, and doesn't really get anywhere. But that's the movie, right? The movie is a lot of talk without really saying anything, but when he does say something, what he says is, this is not the way it used to be. Says, right, people were born and they celebrated, and people died and you were sad, and now we just want to get through it. They just say, Rabbi, make it short. And I can tell you from personal experience how many times I've heard people say that, no matter what the thing is, you know, a wedding or a funeral, right? Not that they have better places to go, but they'd rather be any place but where they are, right? And that's I think that's a part of this, right? And so yeah, they're never going to get there, and maybe that's part of, you know, the movie's idea of that's what modern American humanity is like, right? You know.
Yeah. Hubie, did you have a comment?
I have a question. Actually, on The Wandering Jew, that was terrific. On the movie, they show him in the Volkswagen. I thought that was very neat.
Yeah.
Because on the accident, I think the actor, what his name, Sorrell, he doesn't seem to react, and I didn't understand that.
When they have the car accident,
Yeah, he doesn't seem to react, and I didn't understand that.
Yeah, well, I think the way I read it was that he's so upset, he can't even get out of the car. You know, they have to come around and sort of coax him out of the car. He loves that car so much. You know, I mean, we saw at the beginning, you know, he's telling kids, you know, watch the car. It's just got a new wax job, right? And you know, he loves this Volkswagen so much, which of course is a bone of contention among the friends anyway, right? Adenstein doesn't want to get in the car. He says, you know, does he say something? I know how to hold a grudge. Is that what he says? Something like
and
that.
he distinctly said, this is a German car. Why are we riding in it?
Right. And, you know, and how, you know, he would never do such a thing. And there's the few other little comments about it, you know, after the accident too. There's sort of a comment like, yeah, it should happen to this car, you know, to Hitler's car. And remember, Volkswagen especially, right, was considered to have been developed by, you know, I mean, Hitler didn't design it by any means, but there were a lot of people who held a grudge against Volkswagen, I'd say longer than they held one against Mercedes. Right? So my first trip to Israel in 1972 with my parents, my father was shocked to see all the buses with the Mercedes logo. And then, of course, it was explained to him that Germany was paying reparations to Israel. And that's why all the buses are Mercedes, you know. So but it was a shock, right? So.
And a lot of the taxis. Ed, did you have a comment? And then Alice?
Yes, a few comments, and maybe Ike, you can comment on them. First of all, the whole soundtrack of the movie was a carousel, a merry-go-round going around and around and around and around. And it was repetitive for basically the whole movie. And it certainly added to the theme of the movie. Secondly, I was interested. This movie was 68, before the age of drones, and there was a significant part of the movie with long overhead shots of the orange bug going around and around in streets. And I was wondering, how did they do that, other than they had gigantic cranes or something, but I didn't even think that maybe a crane could be that tall.
Yeah.
Thirdly, I absolutely loved Godfrey Cambridge's shtick. It was, you know, one of the great humorous high points of that movie. And fourth, I'd like you to comment on the Yellow Coffin. At the end of the movie, the guy takes the coffin and paints it yellow and then climbs in.
Right.
Okay, there you go.
Okay, I made notes so I could try to remember all of that. So yeah, let's start with the music. I mean, so I think you know, no one would go out and buy this soundtrack, I don't think, but you know, but it's music that was written for the movie to sound like carousel music, right? It even has some lyrics, right? At the beginning, you know, there's even words to that song about Braverman, you know, what kind of a man Braverman was, right? Which, by the way, don't forget that we look at names, right? The names of all these characters, perhaps, but none has more meaning than Braverman, right? So a better man than the ones we're actually traveling around with, maybe. I don't know. What do they say about him? As a second-rate, he was a second-rate talent of the highest order, which is maybe the best line in the movie. This jaunty music juxtaposed with a serious subject, so to speak, right? Death and funerals. It actually illustrates some of what the Rabbi character is saying, right? That we'd rather do anything than mourn at a funeral, right? And I will say there are times when I go to funerals these days and they feel more like roasts than funerals. It's one thing when a person is 100 years old, and they've lived a long life. There's a lot of humor is sort of possible at funerals, but sometimes I get to them, especially when there are family and other people speaking, sometimes it's old fraternity brothers and things like that. And I wonder if some of the humor is is about our discomfort with death and mourning and funerals, so there's this jaunty music juxtaposed with the serious, and talk about that's part of what this the original novel that it comes from is this juxtaposition of humor and tragedy, right, is an interesting trick in and of itself, right? You mentioned the aerial shots. Well, back in the days before drones, there were ways to do aerial shots. Of course, a crane would have been one of them. A helicopter was often used for those kinds of shots. My guess in this particular movie, because I'm sure that it was low budget, I'll bet they're shooting out of windows from tall buildings. That they that's the cheapest way to do it. And for someone who knows the city well, and he says he scouted the locations in 5 minutes without even thinking about it. I don't know if I can't imagine that's literally true, but I think that he was certainly capable and able of saying, hey, can we come in for a few minutes? We're going to shoot out of your window. Most of those are in these kind of montage scenes where they're assembled, later in the editing room. So you get a shot at, most likely the actors are not in that car. There's what we call today a second unit. Somebody goes out with a camera, stands in an office window and takes a picture of the car that somebody hired for the role, for the position is doing, okay, just drive down this street, then drive down that street. And so I would guess that they did a lot of the aerial shots that way. Godfrey Cambridge is delightful, right? I'm not sure what else to say about that, except that he brings in a unique view of religion in this. It's it goes by so quick in some ways. He talks about his scores on the regents exams to prove his bona fides for hanging out with them. Now, I'm not sure how many of you even on this call know what that is, but right, New York, the state of New York has high school graduation exams, to their own versions of the SAT and the ACT, right? And, based on your scores on those, are you smart enough to go to college in the State University of New York system or places? So, all the way back when I was applying to colleges, I was looking at one of the State University of New York system colleges, and they wanted my Regents scores. That's what they accepted, not necessarily the SAT, right? So I had to get special permission to use SAT scores. So, there's just a lot that goes by really quickly in that scene. It's worth watching more than once. But he has this view of religion, that religion is about taking care of the other guy, thinking about the other guy, right? A kind of a universalistic view of it. Nevertheless, they can't really settle their differences without some fisticuffs, right? And of course, even preparing for that, right? Here the rules: take off the ring, right? I'm not sure, oh, you got that immediately,
Yeah.
what was going on there, take off the ring, and then he says, you take off the watch, right?
Yeah.
And Jack Warden suggests to them that they could just slap, and then they have rules like fencing, if you hit him, it's a point. If you hit that, it's 10 points, right? So very stylized. And then, of course, once they've had their fight, then they can be friends. And of course, he gives them a bottle of liquor, which fuels the rest of the movie, right? And if you remember in the next scene, now they're driving around, and now all of a sudden, not the overhead shot, but from inside the Volkswagen, handheld camera kind of going, a little bit drunk as it goes. So, and the last thing was the Yellow Coffin, and I'm not sure I can interpret this definitively. Maybe someone else has some ideas about that, but I would connect it to the Yellow Star. And I think that's a part of it. It's a plain pine box, which is sort of a Jewish traditional box. Painting it yellow, I can only think of the Yellow Star and what the shadow of the Holocaust is in this. But I would say that he discovers in the end of that scene that you can't bury yourself, right? I mean, it's sort of the last sort of image of that particular moment. He can get in, he can pull the cover up, but then what, right? So it's I think there's sort of a suggestion there that we all do need community. We all do need friends. We can't be an island. We can't be self-sufficient all by ourselves. And that's my interpretation. I see other hands.
Yeah, Alice and then Neil.
Okay, I just have a couple of comments. One, I wanted to comment about the funeral where Alan King as the rabbi is officiating, because I think we all as moviegoers I think I knew after maybe a few seconds that they were in the wrong funeral. I mean, I think they tried to make that obvious because they weren't saying like who it was. I kept wanting to hear a name. So for me, that was not an explanation. It was a way of showing the interplay between something being unique and something being universal. Because obviously every funeral is about a unique person, but then on the other hand, they're all the same. It's about the end of the life of every person. So I just thought, to me, it really struck me that was a pretty long scene, that they were in there for a long time. And I think there was a reason for that. So that was one comment. My other comment was about, there's a lot about that they were in this VW bug, a lot of things that you've already said, Rabbi, and other people have said. But for me, a lot of it had to do was that these 4 guys were stuck in this car for a long time together. And it just was a good vehicle for them to have all these different discussions and, what was meaningful to each of them. And also for me, I'm not from New York. I have visited New York several times and obviously have read a lot of books and seen a lot of movies that took place in New York. But I thought it was a really good way of showing Jewish New York, Brooklyn, New York. It just evoked for me a lot of things that I think about when I think about what New York City is like to live in. So I thought he did a good job of doing that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. New York is sort of a character in a lot of the movies that we've seen, right? Crossing Delancey, New York is a character, right? Even in the Pawnbroker, right? New York is a character in that movie. And by the way, I always point out that as a New Yorker, Sidney Lumet does not film New York like other directors film New York. How many movies have we seen set in New York where, the first scene is the skyline, the Empire State Building, in the old days, of course, the World Trade Center, right? It's the immense buildings of New York, the glorious, scenes. Woody Allen does it in his movie Manhattan, where of course Manhattan is the main character of the movie, really, right? But Sidney Lumet almost never shows us a recognizable landmark in New York. I'm hard pressed to think of one. Certainly not in this movie. It's neighborhoods and street corners, and this movie. You've got 4 characters, friends in New York, but they live in 4 different parts of Manhattan, right? Upper East Side, Upper West Side, Greenwich Village, and Lower East Side, right? So, which I think it's like the history of Temple Emmanuel in New York City, which is now at 65th and 5th Avenue. That's, I think, its 4th or 5th home in Manhattan, because to go from 14, they went from the Lower East Side. I think they had 2 buildings on the Lower East Side, an apartment and a tenement, then their first building, which was an old church. Then they built their first building on 14th Street and another one at 34th Street, and then finally to 65th Street, right? Because if you lived at 65th Street, 34th Street was too far to go, right? So you want to understand that even in Manhattan, the Upper East Side and the Upper West Side are 2 different worlds, right? And the Lower East Side and Greenwich Village, another 2 different worlds. And so these guys are friends and they see each other, but not that often, because they're 2 miles apart, but they're a world apart too. So I think New York's a very interesting character in this movie, and the more you know about New York, the more you see in this movie, I think, too.
Yeah. Neil, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry I couldn't get my camera started, but
Okay.
We can hear you.
I don't want to be too critical. It's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Yeah, right.
And the nice thing about the rabbi here is, I'm sure when you do a funeral, you always find something nice to say about the person, no matter what they did in their life. And I think your eulogy about this movie reflects your good personality. But this movie was not a good movie.
Yeah.
And it was like a 1960s, to my view, of course, and I could be wrong, version of a buddy movie. This was like an Adam Sandler movie, and I love Adam Sandler, don't get me wrong. And, they casted a bunch of their favorite comedians, Alan King and Godfrey Cambridge, because they realized, this was a weak script. One thing that did strike me, and I wonder if it struck anybody else, is it seemed that it was punched up a couple of places. There were some wonderful Woody Allen-like throwaway lines in it. And then there was a scene where this guy's buying a hot dog. And, oh my God, is that Woody Allen doing a little cameo? So I wonder if they brought Woody Allen in to throw some funny lines in there. But I think, this movie was not that deep. I think the analysis is deeper than the movie. The most entertaining part of the movie was Vanessa and the rabbi discussing people that mistakenly have come to services.
Okay.
It was. Let me say one thing and I'll get off here too. Alice beat me to the punch, but you could see that joke coming from a mile away. And they just dragged it on and on with Alan King. What rabbi have you ever seen hit a table like that and give a speech like that?
No. I've seen that.
Okay. I
I've
stand
seen
corrected.
I'm not speaking about my colleague.
Right, I'm not talking about Rabbi Serotta or Rabbi Moffat.
Okay, well, I could be wrong.
I will take what you said as a compliment, actually, all the way around. I think, objectively speaking, you're totally right. This is not a good movie, right? This is and when you think about this director, who I'm extolling his virtues, right? You put this movie up next to Dog Day Afternoon or Serpico, or 12 Angry Men, right? I mean, this is not even good by his standards, right? So I'm not arguing for its cinematic value say. And I think it is, you know, there was a kind of filmmaking in the 1960s, which was a little bit loose, you know, and this is a pretty good example of it. I mean, Paul Mazursky was working around the same time with movies like Alice in Wonderland, you know, Hal Ashby. I mean, all these guys, especially to our modern eyes now, they all look like they were working without a plan. And this movie is kind of reflects that. So I do think it kind of reflects the time. It's a really hard movie to criticize in a way because it's a movie about how dumb criticism is, right? I mean, you know, 4 guys who make their living criticizing other people and how shallow that is as a way to live, right? So you know, it's hard to pan it without sounding like them, right? But I think you know, you start wondering if you're teaching a class, you know, from Little Nemo to Little Abner, right? Which is the class that that one of the character Holly's going to be teaching, right? About comic strips. So and they say, one of them says to him, from low middle culture to high middle culture, you know, you're a maven, right? You know about this stuff. So I'd say I think it has its charms, and like I said, I'll take it as a compliment that I'm extolling them. You know, so there are some things I find humorous, some things I find charming in it. But by an objective standard, it's not a good, certainly not a great movie, probably not even a good one. I'm not sure what Roger Ebert thought of it, you know, how many stars it was given, you know. But I do think it you know, so is it a real Jewish classic for us? Well, look, you know, it's maybe not in my top 50, but, you know, we're kind of into, you know, the top 50, first of all, not every movie is actually available, right? But also, I think we're now past sort of the classics like Gentleman's Agreement and into this is an interesting Jewish document. And that's what I think it is. So,
Rabbi, I agree with you. Just seeing New York and all the old places, it was really interesting. I just wanted to remind everyone that tonight there is at 7 o'clock a Tikkun Olam program on food insecurity on the North Shore. And we have different speakers coming in to speak. And then this week is Bob Morgan on Sunday. You can come and see him in person if you want. And then, you know, the next week, you know, Thanksgiving, we have a little break. So there's no classes on Thanksgiving. There will be Shabbat. There's always Shabbat. But yeah.
Great. Well, thank you everybody for coming out. I thought it was a lively conversation for a movie that's not that great.
Agreed. Agreed.
I'm glad. Thank you. I hope you had some fun watching it. I mean, I do that. You know, I've watched it, I think 3 times this week, which, you know, I don't remember the last time I saw it. And I got to say, the more you watch it, the more there are these funny little lines, you know, that just, by the way, that's not actually Woody Allen at the hot dog stand, but it is a guy dressed up to look like Woody Allen at the hot dog stand. So I just want to clarify that. From what Neil was saying, they certainly knew from Woody Allen, I mean, who was nearby making movies at the very same time. I don't think he punched up the dialogue in this. I have no evidence of that, but they may well have seen some of his early work and said, no, it's got to be funny like Woody Allen lines, right? But
and next week we'll be able to see, and we'll
yeah.
What we have to say about watching a Woody Allen movie.
I know that's hard in itself these days, unfortunately. But anyway, I just like when he pulls the little Volkswagen to his face and says out the window, "A classic parallel park."
Right.
Stuff like that just makes me laugh when I hear it. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed it. And
All right, be well. Hopefully I'll see some of you tonight. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.